Hello everyone, and welcome to this recap of a very exciting Blitz tournament to initiate the tournament that we've all been waiting for some time, the Altibox Norway Chess tournament in Stavanger. 8 of the top 10 players in the world ranking lists are competing in that tournament, and they started out by playing a Blitz tournament today in order to figure out who was going to have an extra white. 5 players would get an extra white. 5 players would have to play an extra black in the tournament. And as I mentioned, this is a really strong tournament that we've been waiting for a long time. It's the highest rated average of 10-player tournaments in the history, with a 27.97 average rating of the 10 players. Of the top 10, only Mamedyarov and Ding Liren are not playing. Mamedyarov, Karjakin, who's number 11 on the rating list, is playing, as is Anish Giri, who's number 12 on the list. So the top 10 players, 8 are playing. The top 12 players, 10 are playing. And we had a very interesting Blitz tournament, won eventually by Magnus Carlsen by a clear margin. He won by 2 points at the end of the day, completely dominating the field. He did start out pretty slowly in the tournament, 2 draws in the first 2 rounds against Hikaru, Nakamura and Vishy Anand, but then he put on the turbo and only gave up half a point in the remaining 7 games, and finished with 7.5 out of 9 and 2 points ahead of Hikaru Nakamura and Levon Aronian, who finished on 5.5. Maxime Vachier-Lagrave finished on 5 points, also gets an extra white, and then a very dramatic finish. Vladimir Kramnik beat Sergei Karjakin in one of the last games and took the last spot. That gets an extra white, which certainly is something that will be very beneficial to Kramnik in this tournament. So let's take some of the games here. And as I said, Carlsen started out pretty slowly, but he really played some really great games in the second half of the tournament. And let's start with the game that will have a lot of significance for both players, his game against Sergei Karjakin. Of course, everybody knows that Karjakin and Carlsen played a very tightly contested World Championship match last November in New York, where Carlsen won only in the tiebreak, and Karjakin did win the Blitz World Championship in December ahead of Carlsen, and he's a strong Blitz player. So certainly a very important game for both players here, but Carlsen showed that in this tournament here he's certainly the dominating Blitz player, and we saw that already from move 1, that he really wanted to put the pressure on basically all of his opponents in this Blitz tournament, choosing the Dutch defense, a very aggressive defense as black against Karjakin. I wonder if he would have played that if it had gotten to Blitz games in the World Championship match, but it certainly works out for him here. And he chooses to play the Stonewall setup, which is characterized by building this formation in the center, pawns on d5, e6, and f5. Typically, there will also be a black pawn on c6, but curiously, Carlsen does not play this in this game, and that has to do with move orders, because Karjakin now plays a move order which is pretty rare, putting the knight on h3 rather than the more natural square would be f3. But of course, his idea is that he wants to bring the knights to coordinate well on f3 and f4 and not be in each other's way. But it does leave the knight away from the center for a little while here, and that then induces Carlsen to not go the natural move c7, c6, but instead play knight c6, which wins a tempo because he's now threatening the pawn on d4. It would, of course, not be the case if one of the white knights were on f3, and it allows Carlsen to develop his light-squared bishop, which is always a problem in the Stonewall formation because those pawns are taking away squares for that bishop. But because of white's setup, Carlsen is able to develop this bishop actively to either b7 and a6. So they're already way out of theory, but in any case, in this Blitz tournament, we saw that most of the players tried to avoid too much theory and just play chess, and they didn't want to show, I'm sure, most of their preparation for the classical games that start tomorrow. A very notable notable exception was the game between Wesley So and Hikaru Nakamura that we'll look at next. That was a huge theoretical debate, which was won by So, but Nakamura ended up winning the game. Okay, Karjakin develops naturally as well here. Carlsen grabs some space on the queen side and puts some pressure, uses his light square bishop to put some pressure on this diagonal here. So probably both players are pretty happy at this stage here. After knight f4, because of the threats here to e6 and d5, Carlsen is more or less forced to give up the two bishops here. But in return for that, as we often see in the Stonewall setup, he gets counterplay in the center here. The pawn formation here gives his knight a strong strong square here on e4, which compensates for the missing bishop that he had to trade. So rook e1 was played, rook e8, because there was potentially threats down the e file here, and rook e3, queen d7, and Karjakin then finally decides to get rid of that knight and plays f3 here. And this is a very critical moment. Remember, this is a Blitz game. They have only 3 minutes plus 2 seconds increment, so they have to make their decisions very, very quickly. But this is certainly a critical moment of the game here, because if White is able to play something like this, for example, and get this rook over here, maybe, and there's pressure on this diagonal here, and on the e file, then White will get a really good position here. This is what White wants. So Carlsen is not able to play that. He's walking a tightrope here in terms of generating counterplay before White does, and he finds the right way. Even with the limited time, they play a really good game here. He takes on c4, trying to get counterplay before White builds his pressure, and c takes b3. This is a very important position for the game here, because Black is just grabbing pawns here, but White does have 3 very strong central pawns here, 2 very strong, potentially very strong bishops. So White needed to find a way of activating those bishops, and I don't think Karjakin finds the best way of doing it. He plays d5, which of course opens for this bishop, but there is a problem here. That is that there are some pins down the center here, as we'll see just in a second here. So instead of going d5, I think it would have been better for Karjakin to play f5, trying to open for the bishops in this way. If Black takes this one, then d5 is much stronger than what it was in the game. But who has time to figure such specifics out with very, very little time on the clock here? So d5 gave Carlsen a chance here. He just takes it on d5, and Karjakin takes on b3. That was his idea, that he has a strong pin here on the b3 to g8 diagonal here, and he probably assumed that he will win back the pawn here on d5 with mission accomplished, that he would have opened the position for the 2 bishops. But here Carlsen finds a great move that puts a spanner in the wheel for that plan. He plays a4, forcing White to more or less grab that pawn, because he certainly does not want to trade on d5 here because of that pin down the e file that I mentioned a little bit earlier here. So Karjakin has to grab the pawn, but now there's no pressure down that diagonal, but there is a nice discovered move here by Carlsen, bishop f1, with the rook hitting the queen on a4. Queen has to retreat, and then Carlsen got to trade the light squared bishop, got rid of one of the two bishops that white had here. And now we have a position where material is now even, 5 pawns on each side, but black is better here. Why? For two reasons. First of all, white's king is pretty weak now, pretty vulnerable here. And second, white will at some point in time have to go e5, and then black will be able to control the light squares in front of those pawns and blockade those pawns, whereas black's pawns here, 3 central pawns and queenside pawns here, would have a free route for advancing here. So by this stage, black is better here. And by the way, the knight is also very dangerous, jumping here to a very nice square on c4. Kayakin tries to prevent that from happening. Again, there are pins in the center here. Of course, black is not able to take one because he would lose his queen. But Carlsen just brings the knight to c4. Nice tactics, especially for a blitz game, that white is not able to grab that knight, because then queen d5 just wins this rook on c4. On the other hand, there are threats from the knight here. So Kayakin tries to retreat the rook to f3. Now black cannot take this one because white will check and regain the knight on b2. Black also can't check here on e3 because then there is again this pin down the d file that doesn't work for black. But Carlsen simply just advances his pawns. As I said, his big advantage is that those 3 pawns are much more mobile than those pawns here, because black is controlling the light squares in front of those pawns. So by now this is a pretty dangerous position for white. Very bad position already. Black just keeps improving his position here, centralizing the queen, centralizing the rook, and he starts threatening stuff against white's king here. Rook h6 is almost mating threat. Then white would have to run out on the board here, would not survive long. So Kayakin has to create an escape route on g2 for the white king. If black checks here, white can now go to d2. But the problem is he's so passively placed with the bishop on c1 that now those pawns, this d pawn here, supported by the knight, supported by the rook behind the pawn, is going to win the game for Carlsen here. And I'm pretty sure if this has been a classical game, Kayakin would have resigned earlier here. But now this is the final straw here. Now there's another pin in this position here, causing white to lose material. Kayakin tried f5, but after rook takes e5, he loses at the very least a piece here because of this pin here. So a great game by Carlsen, who took the lead already 1 or 2 rounds earlier and never gave it up, just added to his lead in the rest of the games here. For Kayakin, this turned out to be a bad loss here, because in the end he was left out of the 5 players who gets an extra white. He still had chances. He was actually in position before the last round, but in that game he lost against Vladimir Kramnik, who then took the 5th white instead of Kayakin. Another pair of players who were in competition for the 5 places were the 2 Americans, Wesley So and Hikaru Nakamura. Actually, early on, it looks like that Nakamura was basically out of it, because he started very poorly in the tournament and he was long below 50%. But he also turned up the speed as the tournament progressed and eventually got one of those coveted 5 extra whites. It could have been different though, because in round 7 there was a key game between those two Americans, So and Nakamura, and this turned out to be a very, very important game for the final standings. Started out as a slow English, but then turned into a very sharp Benoni variation instead. And as I said, most of the players in such Blitz tournaments try not to play too much theoretical lines, show their novelties. For example, world champion Magnus Carlsen started 2 games with a 1 knight c3, certainly not a theoretical move. But in this particular game, because it was so important for the final standings and getting that extra white, the two players actually played a lot of theory, and a very sharp line here in the modern Benoni. Still way in theory for many, many moves here. White maneuvers his knight to c4 as is common here. Knight e5 and knight a3. And now White's idea is that he wants to advance in the center here. e4, f4, bring the knight back to c4 perhaps, and then advance in the center with the classical break e4, e5. But before that happens, Black initiates counterplay. Knight h5 was played by Nakamura. One idea is that he wants to bring the knight to f7, the e5 knight to f7 after 7 f5. There's a square here on f7 for that knight, from which it covers the center and solidifies the d6 pawn. White plays e4, and this is a very famous position. Those of you who are interested in chess history might want to look up a game between Korchnoi and Kasparov from the Olympiad in Lucerne in 1982. Very, very famous game where Kasparov won a highly complicated game against Korchnoi in the match between Switzerland and the Soviet Union. And in that game, Kasparov against Korchnoi played rook f8, preparing to go f5. But this is now, there's a lot of theory here, but this has now been shown to be better for White, although Kasparov did win this game. So Nakamura follows current theory, bishop d7, and now according to current theory, a5 is the best move, a pawn sacrifice here, that if the queen takes on a5, then it's very much misplaced. But so instead advances on the king side and f4. So he takes a direct route here, going head on against Black's king side and advances in the center. And Black's problem is that the knight is trapped. He has no squares for this knight, but this was the same as what happened in similar circumstances in this game Korchnoi-Kasparov that I mentioned. And in that game too, Kasparov just ignored the knight hanging on e5 and instead played b5, threatening to regain the knight with the b5, b4 if White grabs it on e5. So this is a well-known theme, highly theoretical position, as I said. But this is slightly different because, so in contrast to Kasparov, actually is able to grab that knight, gives the knight back immediately here, and the position stabilizes a little bit. Queen f3 was played, and I looked this up, and this is actually still a theoretical line. We are already at move 22, but this shows how deep the preparation of some of those players are here. But it's a little bit surprising that they wanted to show it in a Blitz game here. But as I said, it was so important for them to win this game so that it was possible to get that extra white for the classical tournament. So f7 is hanging here. So Nakamura plays f5. G takes f6. And now we see it's a Blitz game, right? Because now Nakamura blunders. He would actually have to take with the bishop here on f6, but he takes with the queen, and that actually drops a piece. So black blunders a piece here. Of course, a blitz game blunder in that white simply takes on e5, and now Nakamura realized that now he's just losing, because if he takes here, the knight can take back with an extra piece for white, and if he takes on e5 with the queen, which is what he did, white simply checks here and grabs the bishop on d7. And of course, if this were a classical game, Nakamura would probably resign somewhere around here, because he's just a piece down with very little to show for it. Okay, he gets one pawn here, but white has everything under control with an extra bishop. But blitz games have their own rules, and we all know that Nakamura is a great fighter in creating counterplay in such positions here. But for quite some time here, So keeps it under control. Bishop g5, a great move here. Of course, if he takes here, then white grabs this rook here. So Nakamura has to keep steering up some problems here. But there's nothing to it, because white has a chance to transform into a winning endgame here. This was not possible, not necessary, by the way. So could also play for an attack, for example, bringing this rook over here and down to f7, in combination maybe with the queen coming here to d7. That would also be an easy win for white here. But So trades pieces. Good advice if you're a whole bishop up. Here is, he took on h5, wins back the queen here with bishop f6, and now white is simply just winning in this position here. Solidifies everything on the second rank here with rook a2. This rook will grab the pawn on d6, and again, in a real game, Nakamura would resign around here, but he continues to play. Of course, it's a blitz game; they're low on time, and surprisingly, So starts going wrong. He has basically an extra piece here, because the two pawns that black has for them is not very strong. This one is easily blockaded, and the other one is a double pawn here. But now he starts going wrong. There's no need to give black the chance to repair his pawn structure. Now he basically has a pawn that actually is useful on the king side, but still this should be an easy win for white. The a6 pawn here is very, very vulnerable to the white bishop, and no doubt that white is easily winning here. But again, in a blitz game, it's not as easy as it looks. The easiest way, I think, would be to play e5 here, give back one of the pawns, because he's going to either win this one back, or if black defends it passively, then this d6 pawn is going to win the game. The rook will come behind the passed pawn with an easy win for white. But So starts maneuvering around a little bit, and suddenly it's not so easy anymore, because the pawn got 2 squares ahead here, and black has a clear plan now of advancing his king and creating counterplay. So it's probably still winning for white, but not as easy as it was, because although he won the a pawn, black got counterplay with the king. And remember, this is still a blitz game. They are blitzing out their moves at this point in time, being down to only a few seconds here. Still winning for white here, but he needs to be accurate here, and it's not so easy with low on time here. The easiest win, I think, is probably something like bishop b5 to try to go behind the g6 pawn. Why is that important? That's because from that square it also helps blockade the passed pawn on c3. So white would still be winning, but So goes after it with the king instead, which was much less powerful, because now black has 2 passed pawns that are just advancing here and not so easy to control. By now I think it's a drawn position here, but a lot of stuff happens here. king e3 is not the best move. He should have gone rook a1 instead, harassing this bishop here instead. But who can look at such intricacies with the time running out here? Bishop c4 and bishop a4. And by now it's actually a drawn position. If white moves the bishop, black will play d3, and white would have to trade the bishop for that pawn. He may even have to sacrifice his rook for the second pawn here, but then he will be able to draw with his own h-pawn here. This would be a logical outcome here. But So miscalculates here with very low on the time. He goes rook a2 and allows rook takes c4, and probably thought that he was going to queen first, and then he would be winning. If black plays c2, then he will just take it off and queen here, and white is winning. But what he probably missed playing a blitz game, just blitzing out the game, was that black can just go back to c8 with the rook here, and when white queens, suddenly black has these two monsters here on c2 and d4, and by now the position is winning for black instead. And actually, in this position here, So resigned because he realized that he's too slow. Black will queen first. 7, and then black will go in d4 and pick up this pawn on h8. So a massive turnaround here that turned out to be very important for the tournament standings. Nakamura went on then to grab one of those 5 extra whites, whereas So turned out to drop out of the top 5s. He still had the chance though, but he had a pretty dangerous and difficult task in order to qualify as one of the extra whites. He had to beat Magnus Carlsen in the last round. Carlsen had already won the tournament at this point in time, but of course wanted to win even this game, and it was a pretty formidable task for So to beat the tournament leader here, but that was necessary if he wanted to get one of those extra whites. Again, Carlsen, the Stonewall system in the Dutch defense, and So plays bishop f4, one of the solid systems against the Stonewall, and he actually gets close, gets a strong position in the opening here, because Carlsen makes a mistake, a blitz game mistake, where he plays b6 too soon. He needed to solidify the position a little bit before, something like queen e7 perhaps, maybe bring the knight to e4 first, before doing something for this bishop. But he plays b6, and So immediately pounces here with knight g5, where there's pressure against this pawn here, and there's pressure on this diagonal here, because there's some sacks where the rook on a8 would be loose. So Carlsen has nothing better than to retreat the knight to b8. So really a big concession by black here, but it speaks to the solidity of the Stonewall system, that black is actually not that much worse in most other openings. If you lose 2 tempi, going knight d7 and then two moves later having to go back to b8, you'd be in deep trouble. But not so in the Stonewall. You're still in the game, but white is of course clearly better here. Castling queenside is a good move by So here, because his king is safe here, and he's able to attack both down the c file, but certainly also on the king side here, advancing the h-pawn or playing down the open g file here. So clear advantage for white coming out of the opening here. But Carlsen is very resourceful, we all know that, and he's managed to contain the disadvantage at this point. But no doubt that white is clearly better in this position here. And in a classical game, this would be a really dangerous position for Carlsen to be in versus So here. But now So starts playing a little bit too simplified. He allows some trades, which he shouldn't do. Instead, he should either play a move like knight b5, threatening to advance with the rook to c7 perhaps, or he could just start doubling up on the c file here with the 2 rooks. But in any case, he should not start trading pieces, because for each piece that is traded, black is able to dig in and to solidify his position. So the move knight e5 is not best. It allows a trade that black is happy to perform here, and the knight comes to e4. Now rook c2, but by now it's a little bit too late, because black has bishop a6, threatening bishop d3. So white has to go for a second trade. Trades here, and by now the position is more or less even. And So has spent a lot of time here. Carlsen, all over the Blitz tournament, played very, very fast and had a time advantage in basically all his games. This should be a draw. So has to try to win to qualify for one of those 5 extra whites. So instead of playing a solid move like queen c2, defending the king side, instead he goes hunting on the queen side. But this allows blacks to control the c file here with his rook here. So this is certainly already better for black here. Now Carlsen just starts collecting pawns. There's one pawn goes, another pawn goes here. So, by the way, was not able to grab this pawn here, because that would lose a rook here with a check here. So by now it's basically just too many pawns for black here. Defending the mate on g7. And those extra pawns, he has 3 passed pawns on the king side. Basically just an easy win now, 4 passed pawns on the king side. And a few moves later here, So just resigned, as those pawns just are ready to advance here. So he could have gotten a draw in this game, but he needed to win. So hats off that he tried everything he could. But by losing this game, So was left out of those 5 who has an extra black in the classical tournament that starts tomorrow. So summing up, a great day of exciting Blitz chess here. There were quite some blunders. If you look through the games from the tournament, there were quite some blunders. But that's, of course, how it is when you play 3 minutes and 2-second games. Carlsen showed that he was outstanding shape for this tournament here. I'm sure the home fans back in Norway will be delighted to see that. And let's see if he's able to keep that up in the tournament that starts tomorrow. The other 4 winners, so to speak, who gets an extra white out of the Blitz tournament here are Hikaru Nakamura, Levon Aronian, Maxime Vachier-Lagrave, and Vladimir Kramnik. They will all have an extra white in the tournament. So an excellent day here. I look forward to the classical tournament that starts tomorrow at 10 a.m. Certainly we will have some interesting games there, and certainly it will be an interesting tournament with almost all the best players playing in this tournament. So this has been GM Lars Bo Hansen, Don Corleone for in ICC. I look forward to hearing back from you here on ICC some later time. Thank you.